Man vs. 50 with author Richard Maloof. Real advice and real stories on topics, regardless of age, and important to the modern man. Now, here's Richard.
All right, how's it going?
Good.
Here with another episode, and very excited again for episode number 2.
Yep.
And I know you and I have been talking a lot this week about some different things, and the one thing about this show that you and I are very adamant about is the fact that it's very unscripted.
Correct.
The fact that it's literally, a show about our life experiences, like an autobiography of our life experiences, to help people, to help men, to help really anybody get a better understanding of some of the things you go through in life. And one thing that kind of stood out to me that I've been doing a lot of self-reflection on is just things in my life that really have shaped who I am. I'm still learning a lot about it, but definitely how it shaped my life. I read something, been doing a lot of reading lately and just looking at things to get inspiration and understanding. And I read this quote, not a quote, but it's a quote actually by Socrates, saying, "To know oneself is the foundation of wisdom and ethical living."
Wow.
And, you look at that and you wonder, okay, what basically is he saying? And it's basically having self-awareness. And I think a lot of life is, for me, has been a reflection, looking back on gaining and learning a lot of self-reflection about myself. Again, the one thing, and again, if somebody's new to the podcast, the one thing I like about our dynamic is we chose 2 very different paths in our life, and they've, not saying one's good, one's bad, just different.
Right.
And we're both the same age. You're married. Well, let's take a step back. You grew up in a house with a mother and father.
Correct.
You have been married for how many years now?
This is 29 this year.
Okay, 29 years. And you have 2 children. And I grew up in a broken household, was raised by my grandparents. I was married once. I don't have kids. So we just went on 2 different trajectories. And again, the point of this show is understanding what we've learned along the way. Not one's bad, not one's good. It's just different. And that's what will help, I think, people understand, no matter what avenue or path you took on this journey, you might have experienced some of the same things in life that the other person has experienced. So again, that's the foundation of the show. Very unscripted, very not from a clinical standpoint. I see there's a lot of amazing podcasters out there, doctors and everyone who speaks on certain topics from a very clinical way. And the one thing pride ourselves on this show is that we're coming from a very organic, this is how I learned this. I didn't learn it in school.
Right.
I learned it on the streets. You know what I mean? It's like, so I think that's the joy I'm trying to bring from this show. And, I think if you listen to the way we break things down and talk about things, they're relatable to anybody.
Sure.
Because it just is. And so one thing we talked about, a topic that I brought up is regret.
Yeah.
And I have found from talking to other people that the word regret has a very negative meaning. I think even when I said it to you, you took a step back and were like, okay, this is negative. Like, I don't regret anything.
Yeah.
So I think, and I was thinking about this, like, okay, regret, why is it so negative? Because it just seems like, I wish I would have done this and I did it wrong, and that's regret.
Right.
And then I'm like, okay, well, have you heard the phrase, I came to the fork in the road and went right or left? And I guarantee at a certain age, someone has said, hindsight is always 20/20.
Yes.
You know what that hindsight is always 20/20? That's regret. Okay. So we can mask it, we can pretty it up, but ultimately there are things we regret. Hindsight's always 20/20, or we came in the fork in the road and went right and we wish we would have gone left. And that ultimately is a topic that we'll spend a while on, because I truly believe it shapes us as men, women, humans. It truly does.
Yeah, it shapes our whole life.
Right.
That's who we are.
Yeah. And so I think as we touch on this, one thing we talked about, and I said, Chris, what was one of the biggest regrets you had in your life? And your first response was, I don't think I have any regrets.
Yeah.
And then you started thinking about it a little bit more. And again, they don't have to be negative. It was just a decision.
And that's where I went.
Right.
Was I try not to be negative.
Right.
I am, but I try not to be. But so for me to think of the word regret, what do you regret? Well, I think everything has been a stepping stone, and it's got me where I am, and I love where I am. So I don't look back and go, oh, what a disappointment. So I don't connect, or I do in my mind, I connect regret with disappointment and negative. But then the more we talked, I started using the word wish.
Yeah.
I wish I had that fork in the road. And that's when you gave the example of the fork in the road. So, yeah. But
well, I think one thing that I've been doing a lot of thinking on this, obviously, is that I thought a lot about, in the moment, I feel like I felt regret. And then years later, I understood it better. And maybe that wasn't my path. And so at the time, maybe there was a larger hand in this than my hand, and pushed me in a different direction, because that still wasn't ultimately my goal. So, or who I was going to be or become, or my path, right? Or my journey. And I think that in the moment, regret is real. And it's like, I mean, and in other shows we talked about, the flow of my thought process of the regrets and the guilt and the fear that lead to stress and anxiety, that leads to decisions and choices we make. And it's this constant flowing circle that keeps happening because one affects the other. I've learned this at 52, that everything in life has a ripple effect. And it just does. I think, some people call it karma, some people call it whatever, but it has a ripple effect. And all the decisions you make, no matter how they're driven, will have some effect on something else. So regret is, again, a huge part of life. But it also is a great part of life because it shapes who we are. And before we get to what we were going to talk about with your regret, me asking you, is it's another reason, I read this article where a lot of companies will hire CEOs of failed companies because they know they won't make the same mistake twice. And it makes sense, right?
Yeah,
so I think we sometimes push it aside and don't address it. But I think if I lived in regret so long, it's going to affect the rest of my life. Yeah. So let's get back to what we were talking about. So Chris's biggest regret.
It's kind of it's a lump. I was a sophomore in high school, and I decided I wanted to go into the hotel business. We stayed at a resort in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I said, man, it would be fun to work at a hotel. And my dad said, you can get a degree in that. And I said, you have got to be kidding me. A degree in hotel and restaurant, I'm in. And so I did it. And my goal was, or desire was, to go to work at an island resort hotel in the Caribbean. That was the dream. Really, Bora Bora was my dream, but I don't speak French. So, okay, Caribbean. Well, I could do that. I can speak enough Spanish. So I'm about to graduate. I'm engaged. I tell, Lori, hey, I want to, go to work on an island. And she said, oh, I'll follow you anywhere. And then we got married. And I said, okay, I'm going to start looking. And she said, for what? And I said, for the island job. And she goes, well, I didn't think you were serious. That's, what part of me didn't sound serious? Right. And she goes, well, I'm not moving to an island. And I said, but that's the whole reason I got into the hotel business, was to work at a destination location. And she said, well, I'm not going. And so we moved. I just really wanted to move. And so we moved to Dallas. And I hated every minute of that. But
right.
the regret is that we didn't take the chance.
Right.
Go try. And if you talk to Lori today, she says it too. She says, I wish we would have tried. Just go see. Because that, again, the experience, the lifestyle, just, I mean, it was literally going to go live in another country for who knows how long. It could have been 18 months. And we both said, well, this is terrible. I don't ever want to do this again. But as we sit here today, we don't know. And,
right.
and that ship has sailed. So
right. Well, you think about it too. You don't know, exactly. and I talk about your path, and you look back and you have Chandler and Mason,
right.
and they got to grow up near their grandparents.
Correct.
So it wasn't your path.
Exactly. Well, and at the time, and that's what you said earlier was, have you heard the phrase, you can't see the forest because of the trees?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In that moment, that's the only thing I can think about is, this is what I want to do, or I'm supposed to do. But to your point, there's a bigger hand in here. God's got a plan. Don't really think this is
right.
where you need to be going.
Right.
Why? I don't know. Now, with the definition of regret that we were talking about, it doesn't have to be negative. I don't negatively regret not going. I wish I could have tried it. Now I just go to a resort and I'm a guest. And so I don't have to work there. So it's kind of nice. But I don't negatively regret it because I see that Ripple, the outcome, has provided me a 29-year marriage, 2 great kids that, like you said, grew up around their grandparents, had a great school, great college opportunities, work opportunities. And if we had just say that we had been on that island and we just stayed and stayed and stayed, well, I take all those opportunities away from the kids, if we even have kids.
Right.
So,
right. It's so, we talk about this and you take a step back and you start to think, like, what's one of the greatest Christmas movies there is?
Oh, man.
Well, don't say Die Hard, but
I wouldn't.
It's a Wonderful Life.
Okay, that's what I was going to say.
It's a Wonderful Life is that.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So you don't know, when you look at it in that perspective, you say to yourself, wow, I look back and how would the world have been different?
Right.
How would my life have been different if I did move on to that island, you know? And there's another movie, and I think it's really, it's called Family Man, and with Nicolas Cage.
Oh.
And
that one.
It's the same concept.
Yep.
And I relate to that movie very well because, living that single life and, living in a condo downtown and stuff. And it goes back to, he made a decision at the airport to leave his girlfriend at the time. And then one night he's walking down the street and an angel appears and it's not an angel, but in the way an angel will come to you, right?
Right.
And he gets a glimpse, they kept calling it a glimpse, into the life he would have had if he made a different decision. And at first, he's miserable. Like, how did I get here? What am I doing? Kids, dogs, this is not what I wanted. And then by the end, he doesn't want to go back.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And that, you know, it makes you think a lot, you know, about those regrets and those different forks in the road that we come. So yeah, so I think for me,
I was going to say, okay, what's
for me, and I think we've talked about this a little and touched on it, and because this one probably took me a long time to deal with and understand what my journey or path was with that. And I think for the longest time, my biggest regret was my divorce. And I think looking back on it now, I understand it a lot more. Like, I truly understand it. And as you know, I've never, like a lot of people, like, my ex-wife's crazy. I've never said one bad thing about my ex-wife. I mean, salt of the earth, most amazing woman ever. But looking back as my life has progressed and I've done a lot of self-awareness checking, I realized she was emotionally at a different place in her life than I was.
Okay.
I wasn't emotionally mature enough for her. And I was still an emotional child, if you will, in a way. I wasn't mature enough for her. I didn't know what real love was. I didn't from another person like that, right? I just didn't know how to process it all. So I didn't know how to handle her. And so instead of growing that, I threw in the towel and walked away. And for years and years, I beat myself up about it. The guilt, you know, we talk about the regret, the guilt of doing that to her, like, weighed on me so much, to the point where if I got too close to another relationship, I would sabotage it, because she hadn't moved on in her life and she was still single. And I felt like we still talked a lot. We still talked, you know, 5 times a week. I felt like I still had to be there for her and take care of her. And so I sabotaged relationships and could never move on, because I felt like I still had to be there, right? So many years later, she ended up getting remarried, and happily remarried, very happy for her. But it gave me an opportunity to let some of that guilt go, to the point where I could take a step back and think about it and unpack it, you know, and stop beating myself up about it, you know. And I have this tattoo on the side, and it says, you know, basically, when God forgave me, I figured I should do the same. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching. Tune in next week for the second part of Regret. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Man vs. 50 with author Richard Malouf. Don't forget to subscribe.